Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Iran, as well as the nuclear deal. President Hassan Rouhani of that country saying that Iran will never seek nuclear weapons. This is not the first time that an Iranian official is saying so. Even Ayatollah Khamenei, who is the supreme leader of the country, has said a number of times that the country is not ever going to seek nuclear weapons because it's simply against its ideology. President Hassan Rouhani, though, importantly added the caveat that Iran would never seek nuclear weapons with or without this nuclear deal, indicating that if this nuclear deal were to completely fall apart in the coming days, that Iran would still not seek nuclear weapons. He then also spoke then about the European powers to then avoid the mistake of what Washington has done by violating the nuclear deal, the 2015 nuclear deal. As we know, when President Donald Trump was elected, he walked away from the nuclear deal. He said then that the European powers would be responsible for what would occur in the aftermath of the collapse of the nuclear deal. Let's discuss that further, because this adds more pressure on Europe, does it not, going forward about what happens with this nuclear deal. We're joined to discuss this further by Mehran, who is a PhD candidate at Qatar University and assistant director at the Ibn Khaldun Center for Humanities and Social Sciences, a research focus on Iran and the Persian Gulf region. He's joining us now from Doha. Joining us from Dubai is Isidor, who is a geopolitical analyst. And joining us from Bristol in the UK is Gunter, who is a senior lecturer in European politics at the University of the West of England. Thank you to all three of you for joining us. Mehran, let me start with you. President Hassan Rouhani, again, repeating something which Iranian officials have a number of times said in the past, so nothing new there, but him indicating that this is the stance with or without the nuclear deal. This is a sign, again, to the Europeans, is it not, about what may occur if this deal falls apart?
As you mentioned, Iran has stated that Iran will not acquire nuclear weapons, regardless of the deal, even before the deal was struck in 2015. However, with the Europeans triggering the dispute resolution mechanism, one might expect that because of the lack of success of the Europeans in keeping the deal alive, Iran is still believing that the Europeans are interested in keeping the JCPOA intact, despite the fact that the dispute resolution mechanism was triggered. There has been a lot of talk about this will lead to the reimposition of the UN Security Council sanctions on Iran. However, I continue to doubt that it will go that far, at least today. Looking at the possibilities in the near future, Europeans have been trying to cater to Iran's request after the U.S. withdrawal from the agreement, particularly with the insects or other measures that they could take to counteract the negative impacts of the U.S. withdrawal or the imposition of the U.S. sanctions. However, the dispute resolution mechanism itself has a series of steps, each with a defined time limit, which can be extended by consensus, which is also an important point to realize. The remarks by President Rouhani can be taken as threats when he said that Iran might be seeking to withdraw from the non-proliferation treaty. However, that should also be seen in the context of Iran wanting to have some leverage in the negotiations that will ensue, because the DRM itself requires negotiations by all the remaining parties in good faith. Yeah. And it will be interesting to see how Joseph Borrell, the new European Union foreign policy chief, basically, will be able to handle this issue.
Okay, so Gunter, let me bring. Give us, if you can, what you think may be the European point of view on this, because what's been understood to an extent, and even admitted by certain European officials, is that there was pressure on the Europeans to declare Iran to be in violation of the nuclear deal and to then trigger that dispute mechanism. This is not looking very good for Europe, is it?
I'm not entirely sure about that. I mean, it is true there was quite a bit of a debate to what extent some of the European powers, in particularly Germany, was somehow pressured by the US to trigger this dispute settlement mechanism. The official statements that I heard from German foreign minister was that the decision to trigger that mechanism was already taken 3 days before the US did, in fact, make a request to act in this way. But certainly the German side has insisted, the official side has insisted, that the decision was made by the three European powers, that is the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, to trigger that mechanism beforehand.
But what I'm talking about, Gunter, because as you know, the optics are what is important, right? So from the Iranian point of view, it's about the optics, right? It's that the US said, do it, and then the Europeans said yes. Now, of course, as you said, yes, all those European officials, including the German officials, said that this decision had already been taken, but nevertheless, on the outside, what's come out to the rest of us, you and I, is that this happened because of US pressure. That's not looking good, right?
Well, I mean, there is obviously there used to be quite a close alliance between the United States and the Europeans, particularly in this matter. But the deal was originally negotiated under the Obama administration. So in the current context, where the United States under Trump has brought this deal to an end unilaterally, of course, saying that we would still want to use that mechanism from the European side can be certainly seen as the insistence that the deal is not dead as yet. And in that respect, it is actually quite ironic that the Americans themselves have put pressure on the Europeans to come back to the negotiation table, as it were. So this mechanism, the dispute settlement, but also later on potential EU involvement of the United Nations and so on, was of course part of the original deal, because it was known at the time in 2015 that there probably would be, bumps in the road, as it were. There would be ups and downs, there would be critical situation. And it was based on this nice liberal idea that you just need a nice, good, workable institutional arrangement that is flexible enough in order to settle such difficult times, as it were. So in that respect, I see it more as a positive sign, and certainly the Europeans, for them, it has always been important to uphold these mechanisms and to show that they are capable in their own foreign policy to make such agreements work.
Isidor, what are your thoughts about this? What do you think happens in this regard? Do you think that the Europeans want to, in fact, escalate the situation all the way to the UN Security Council?
Well, thanks for having me, first of all. I think the context here is very important, and there are two contexts. One is the international. The U.S. under the U.S. government under the Obama administration and the EU were close allies in this matter when signing the deal. This relation between the main European powers and the United States changed with Trump, and especially after the unilateral withdrawal. And one of the main fears of the Iranian regime has been, to face against a united U.S. and European strategy against Iran. So this means that now, when they are seeing that the European powers are getting a little bit closer to the U.S. View on Iran, they are doing these threats. It's just trying to prevent this union from happening again. Also, another context is the internal one. I mean, the regime right now is facing big protest. They are mostly anti-government protests. The chance they are creating a precedent here, and the Iranian regime knows that if a new round of UN sanctions were to happen from this reunion between the European powers and America, this would fuel the protests in a very big way. Because the nuclear program has already costed.
But do you not think Isidor at some level that this actually plays to the Iranian government's hands, where if there are more sanctions placed, they'll say, "Listen, it's the sanctions."
Yeah, but at the same time, they have to say, "Okay, but I mean, they say, yeah, these are the sanctions, so it's not our fault." But right now, as we speak, and with the protests ongoing, the protesters are starting to say, well, maybe we are earning these sanctions because we are trying to achieve this nuclear program that is closing the doors to the rest of the world. I'm not sure that protesters
are going to buy anymore the official discourse, saying we are struggling because the United States is the enemy and they are trying to impose more and more sanctions. Maybe a big part of the Iranian population is starting to rethink that and saying, okay, maybe we have to change the whole strategy, and the regime is condemning us to these sanctions.
Mehran, I wonder where your thoughts on what President Rouhani said, and other officials, I believe Foreign Minister Zarif may have said this too, if I'm not mistaken, that Iran is not walking away from the JCPOA completely. There is still very much a window there for if, for example, the U.S. were to come back into the fore, or if the Europeans were able to figure out a mechanism in which Iran gets its rights as promised within the JCPOA, that it would roll back what it's been doing over the past number of months. Do you think that that's a bit, I don't want to use the word naive, but a bit too optimistic, that Iran is still holding out hope in some way that this will survive?
Definitely optimistic, but I think one thing is very important to remember when we're discussing this is that Iran, again, has repeatedly said that it's not seeking to acquire nuclear weapons. So that's one thing. And regardless of the deal or regardless of the dispute resolution mechanism or all of these things, Iran will not, as a policy, will not seek to acquire nuclear weapons. And that will have serious ramifications if Iran changes that policy as well. So for now, I don't think that's a possibility. And the other thing is that since the beginning of Iran's gradual abandonment of the nuclear deal, which again, until today, it's still in the nuclear deal, it was careful to state that all of Iran's measures are in line with the JCPOA text itself. So that's also a key point that we should remember. And the third point is that the dispute resolution mechanism itself is part of the JCPOA. And if you look at the text, the paragraph 36 of the JCPOA, you can see clearly that this measure taken by the Europeans, it's not really going to kill the deal immediately. And in a more optimistic sense of it, you can see that this move will put more pressure on all sides, including Iran and the European parties to the agreement, as well as to an extent to the United States, to figure out a way out of this situation that...
Well, Mehran, Donald Trump has made it very clear, hasn't it? And officials have made it very clear the way out of this is for Iran to come back to the negotiating table, sit down with the U.S. and others, and negotiate essentially really a new deal, which would include then things like ballistic missiles otherwise. Is there an appetite for that, do you think, on the part of Iran?
Saying correct, but again, Iran, the Supreme Leader has repeatedly said in the past couple of months that Iran is open to negotiations, but not with the U.S. So that's a policy that they're advancing for themselves right now. But an important factor in that is that negotiations are a key part of the DRM. So the dispute resolution mechanism requires negotiation. So in and of itself, negotiations will have to be restarted in a way, obviously under the context of resolving the dispute of Iran's non-compliance or the European Union's non-compliance. But within those negotiations, and an optimistic eye will see that something good can come out of this, where the deal will be saved and there will be a path forward with regards to Iran-U.S. participation in the agreement as well.
All right, so Gunter, let me ask you, do you think that the Europeans too are being a bit too optimistic in some regards, where they also are tempted to bring in then issues of ballistic missiles and otherwise, possibly under U.S. pressure or their own concern, either or, because, the JCPOA is not about ballistic missiles and Iran's other activities in the region, as that would be referred to. Do you think that they would be able to then, within this dispute mechanism and those negotiations that need to occur, that dialogue that needs to occur, will they be able to really keep it on topic, really?
I think so. At least they have a joint interest that it stays within the original realm of the negotiated agreement. The reason for that is that that agreement was one of the major showpieces that the European Union had as a success story of its own foreign policy, or the beginnings of its own foreign policy. Since Trump has come into power, that pressure has increased, that the EU has to show that on its own, even without the United States, it is able to conduct a foreign policy. Of course, when you say the Europeans, there are some fine distinctions in that. There is, on the one hand, the three European powers. Yeah. On the other hand, there's also the European Union as a whole, with its high representative. And the original deal was very much achieved on the basis of the participation of the EU and its high representative, who at the time was Mrs. Mogherini, who visited Tehran, for example, on several occasions, and was seen as the kind of honest broker who made the deal a success story. If that now all goes out of the window, it would be quite damaging to the very idea of a European foreign policy. So for that reason, I think they will go a long way in order to safeguard and rescue their deal. And I would say there's at least a window of opportunity until the US elections in November to get some things moving in that area and perhaps even rescue the deal or to come up with some alternative arrangement.
Isidor, what are your thoughts? I know you're sitting right now. I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but what are you hearing around you there on the ground about the nuclear deal and whether it should survive or not? Because there is this huge context, right, of the fact that the UAE and other countries in this region, they're neighbors of Iran and or just regional countries, and all of this affects them in some way or the other, whether they like it or not.
Yeah, first of all, I couldn't agree more with what my colleague said about the European foreign policy and their project, also waiting for the U.S. elections. Here, the sense is, we have these regional tensions for sure, and there is this rivalries in the whole region. However, all the countries around, their main goal is de-escalation. They have learned to live with Iran right on the other, very close to them. They know that if the situation was going to escalate, they are very vulnerable. So the main sense here is de-escalation. So even when there was these attacks in the oil fields of Saudi Arabia or the tankers, all the countries in the region and the EU, the Emirates also, were very, very cautious when accusing Iran, while the United States was taking the lead and trying, to get more allies on board about hardly condemning the regime. The feeling here is what you can breathe all the time is nobody wants the conflict to escalate. They may not agree with the nuclear deal, but at the same time, if that provides some kind of tranquility, it's better than nothing. The U.S. politics are very volatile right now with Trump, and especially because of the elections. We don't know what is going to be the strategy he's going to follow in order to try to gain momentum from the situation with Iran.
Okay, I'm just going to interrupt you because we're running quickly out of time. I do apologize. Mehran, I wanted to give you the final word, just under a minute if you can. What do you think the regional countries right now are thinking? The narrative right now about Iran. I'm not asking you to defend it, but I'm just saying that the narrative about Iran is that it's a malign player in the region, that its influence and its activities are not helpful to regional peace, etc. Would Iran in any way, because of the possible collapse of this deal, and of course that's a hypothetical situation, would it want to act out in some way which would threaten regional countries?
I think Iran, again, today, Foreign Minister Zarif tweeted something about regional dialogue and cooperation. And this is something that the Iranian government has been constantly referring back to every time there is an issue coming up in the region. I think negotiations about Iran's regional activities can be part of a future set of negotiations with the European powers or even with the United States. However, and one point that is very important to remember is that Iran is very, very, very interested in keeping the JCPOA alive. And any future agreement, be it a Trump deal as Johnson proposed or whatever, the JCPOA has to be a part of that other agreement as well. And in the nuclear agreement, maybe some aspects of it can be changed. Maybe dates will be changed, and the sunset clauses may be extended or something like that.
Right.
But the JCPOA itself, the framework, has to be part of any future agreement with Iran. And Iran will not accept anything other than that.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final word. We appreciate Mehran, Isidor, and Gunter for their time today and for putting this all into context for us viewers. We try to give you as many points of view on this issue because the nuclear deal, to many of us, looking from the outside in at least, seems to have already collapsed, if we're completely honest. But Iran keeps insisting that no, those, the fact that it's abandoned slowly certain commitments under the deal, that all of that can really be rolled back if the other parties within this deal were to start beginning to fulfill their commitments and ensuring Iran can gain what it's been promised to have gained within this deal, even since the U.S. violated the deal when Donald Trump came into office. That's already, at this point in time, up in the air. Will the Europeans play ball? What of this dispute mechanism that they have triggered? As Mehran there said, this does require dialogue within the mechanism itself, so dialogue will happen. What will be the result of that dialogue? Will the other issues that all of these parties are concerned about, be it ballistic missiles or Iran's quote-unquote regional activities, come into the fore? And then what does that then mean for the JCPOA? Will we have a Trump deal, as Boris Johnson has also spoken of? We'll keep a close eye on that here in Scope. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss the Trump impeachment trial, which has begun in the U.S. Senate. We have now heard arguments from what I guess we would call the prosecution or the House managers. Representative Adam Schiff talking about and opening the arguments against President Donald Trump, saying that he'll be presenting an overwhelming and damning picture of Trump's alleged misconduct in regards to Ukraine and otherwise as far as obstructing justice. Trump calling all of this a hoax, calling the entire trial, that is, a hoax. And he's defended his phone call with the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, that has led to this impeachment trial. Then we also have the likes of Alan Dershowitz and Ken Starr, who are also going to be then talking later on when the defense comes up about how the articles of impeachment simply do not meet the threshold for impeachment as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Ron Aledo, who is a former CIA contractor and policy advisor in Afghanistan. He's joining us now from Miami. We're also joined by Mark Meirowitz, who is a professor at the State University of New York. He's a New York Maritime College, and is also a political analyst. He's joining us from New York. And joining us from Boston is Brian Frydenborg, who is a writer, academic, and consultant. He specializes in politics, policy, etc. Brian, Mark, and Ron, thank you to all three of you for your time this morning. Mark, let me start with you, if I may. What do you make of Donald Trump calling this entire trial a hoax? It's very important business, is it not, that in impeaching a president? Shouldn't he be taking this a bit more seriously?
Well, I mean, it's Trump speaking, so we have to take that in consideration. But if we boil it down, even calmer voices like the Wall Street Journal and analysts of the Constitution, if you read the Federalist Papers, if you read the previous impeachments, what occurred in the past, this impeachment of the House was completely partisan, completely political. And I do concur with the point that this does not rise to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors. I will add that the Wall Street Journal today in its editorial said that what is wrong, what is missing in this accusation is that it is based on corrupt motives. I think that is a very astute point. In other words, they don't accuse the president of a specific crime. They accuse the president of using political pressure in light of corrupt motives. Now, you can debate that, but many presidents have, I don't want to use the word corrupt, but many presidents have used political pressure on foreign countries to achieve things. And anybody who thinks that's not true, I think, lives in a dreamland.
Indeed.
The bottom line is, at the end of the day, the Senate is not going to convict President Trump. The Democrats cannot get 67 votes. What they might be able to do is get witnesses, because that only requires 51 votes. Next point. And even if they get the subpoenas of the witnesses, the president will invoke executive privilege. So this thing is going to bump along and bump along and bump along, and it's never going to end. And the American people are tired of it.
Let's talk about the issue of witnesses, Ron. Do you think, as Mark there said, that there is a possibility that Democrats may be able to win that argument at least, because they really want the likes of, as you know, Bolton to, for example, testify in this trial? Is that likely to happen? And then the other argument, Ron, on the other side is that if the president really has nothing to hide, why not allow for these witnesses to then testify?
Well, the problem with Bolton is something that already have been discussed many times. One thing is when the head of a department, like the head of the Secretary of State, of the Secretary of Defense, go and talk to the Congress about public policy. But Bolton, as a national security advisor, he was a close and we can say intimate advisor, inner circle of the president. So he was working directly for the president at the White House as a close and personal advisor. So it's very different. That is where executive privilege can come in, like all the thoughts, strategies, secret strategies that Trump might be thinking about how to deal with India or with China or with Russia or Iran, and he might be asked about those issues, and that is what a big obstacle for this testimony, because he's going to claim executive privilege. I cannot tell the world what the president of the United States secret strategies and secret thoughts are about some countries. So I think that is the main obstacle, and I think the Supreme Court will back up Trump if the Democrats try for Bolton or somebody in his inner circle to go and testify.
Okay, so Brian, I want to get your thoughts, specifically on a statement that Donald Trump made in Davos in Switzerland, which you've probably definitely heard of, and I'm quoting him now, "Honestly, we have all the material, they don't have the material," end quote. Speaking there about the Democrats, of course. That doesn't sound very good, right? That sounds like the president and his team are hiding material and essentially obstructing justice.
Well, I mean, that's why one of the two impeachment articles was obstruction of Congress, which is very similar. And when you look at it, like everything else coming from the president's defense team and his surrogates in this situation, that's patently false. We have text messages and statements and corroborated witness testimony from people within his own administration. Again, these are not liberal activists. These are not Democrats working for the Democratic Party. These are people working on the National Security Council, people working for the State Department, people that were appointed by Trump himself, including Gordon Sondland, who gave over $1 million to Trump's inauguration. So these are the people corroborating and getting Trump in trouble, in addition to Trump himself. For example, when he went out onto the White House lawn and basically said, yeah, I pressured the Ukrainian president to investigate my political rival. And with all due respect to my earlier colleagues, point one, the idea that this is some sort of normal political quid pro quo. Yes, politics, the way the world goes around is people offer one thing in exchange for something else. We can offer, for example, an increase in Israeli settlement, an increase in Israeli military funding, as unpopular that may be around the world, if they slow down their settlement expansion or halt it. What we are not permitted to do under our Constitution and under normal ethical rules that operate, at least in the Western world, is I cannot ask you to do something to benefit me politically, personally, for my re-election campaign, to damage one of my opponents, in exchange for military funding, diplomatic support, a meeting at the White House, what have you. So the idea that this is some sort of normal political operation is just absolutely absurd. And the only people that are living in fantasy lands are the people that think that this is acceptable in American tradition and American history. And an example that comes to mind is Richard Nixon, before he was elected president, offering to mediate with the North Vietnamese and have some sort of ceasefire, maybe bring about an end to the war. Whatever it was, he put out diplomatic feelers while he was running for election. And the same thing happened with Ronald Reagan. Now, when he was talking to the Iranians about the hostage situation, both those people were not sitting office holders in the executive branch at the time.
Okay, so Mark, one of the points that Brian there just made, I wanted to expand on that because there has been talk, which the Democrats have now rejected, about an exchange of witnesses in a sense to have, I believe it was Hunter Biden, if I'm not mistaken, to come in exchange for possibly Bolton, I think. Why not just have that? Like, why can't both sides just be a lot more open to being transparent? And if there is an issue, as Ron there said, genuinely of national security and of having classified information outed, why not then just do it behind closed doors? I'm sure such mechanisms exist, don't they?
Well, first of all, on the executive privilege, the Supreme Court held that it's not unlimited. That's the problem with the House's impeachment, because they didn't go ahead and pursue the witnesses. They just went ahead and impeached the president. The obstruction of Congress article is completely invalid in that respect. Second point, on executive privilege, as my colleague spoke, the issues here is the issue whether the president has the right in separation of powers to have conversations with his subordinates, but it's not unlimited. So if it comes up, they're going to go that route, and we're going to be in the courts, and we're going to be doing this in these discussions for weeks and weeks. Here's the problem. The Democrats first came up with quid pro quo. Then they dropped that. Then Pelosi spoke about bribery, and they dropped that. Then they had articles of impeachment on abuse of power, some nebulous point, and obstruction of Congress without going to the court. And now Schiff is speaking in the Senate, and he's speaking about cheating. I mean, this is endless. I assure you the American people are not only, I tell you, the senators, because they're walking out and passing notes to each other, and 24 hours here and 24 hours there. The American people are not paying attention to this. They don't see the gravity of it. Bottom line, did the president commit a crime? No. The bottom line is no military aid was withheld, right? And no investigation of Biden was undertaken. So the point was, did he have bad intentions? Did he have corrupt intentions? That's the Wall Street Journal's point. But he never did it. Many presidents, and again, in reality, and I guess many of this is classified and private, and it should be, presidents do have discussions with foreign leaders. And if we unearth every discussion, including President Obama and Bush and all the other presidents, and we see what they've been talking about with all the foreign leaders, I'd bet you'd see Democrats and Republicans, because my colleague highlights Bush and Reagan and Nixon. Nixon is no paragon of virtue. Clearly, he was going to be impeached and he resigned. But these presidents do things as part of foreign policy that, if open to scrutiny to the public might think is not optimal. But sometimes decisions have to be made in the real world that might not be optimal. So do we impeach and throw out the president every single time just because the House is partisan, controlled by the Democrats? They have unleashed this nightmare on the country, and I don't see it ever ending. It's never going to end. We're going to be talking about this up until the election, and that to me is inexcusable. That's how I feel about it.
Ron, what are your thoughts on that? Because the argument that Mark there just made is one that has been made in the sense that where it's been said, listen, why didn't Democrats just wait for the elections that are coming up this year itself and make their case to the American people against Donald Trump and for their own respective candidate, whoever he or she may be?
Well, I have to agree that this is a political stunt. Okay, listen, they have been trying to impeach Trump since day one, since January 2017. It was part of their agenda. They wanted to go after him anyway, either way, for any reason. And they put all their hopes on the Mueller investigation and the Russiagate thing. And then when in summer of last year, the Russiagate thing came down, they have to come with something else. So they came with this. Just as a way to make their base, the most left-wing base of the Democratic Party happy, and also because they're trying to damage some moderate senators. The senators that are going to vote in favor of Trump, they're going to accuse them of cover-up, they're going to accuse them of not being partial, and then impartial, and then they're going to go after those senators during the elections. So it's all a political strategy. But I just want to mention something about this obstruction of Congress thing. The obstruction of Congress thing is a made-up charge. It's not the same as obstruction of justice. You have to understand this. The United States is a presidential system. It's not a parliamentary system. Like Spain or Italy, like England, it's not a parliamentary system. So when the Congress tells somebody, you have to come here and testify, and the president say the contrary, no, don't go over there, don't testify, that's not obstruction of Congress in the United States. That is the right of the president. And then the third sector of the government, the judiciary sector, is the one who decided. So, and that is exactly what Alan Dershowitz is going to say about this obstruction of Congress fake charge. That is how things work in the United States. When the Congress says one thing and the president says the other thing, the third one, the Supreme Court, they are going to decide. So there is no obstruction of Congress. That is how things work in the United States.
Very well. Brian, do you think that the Democrats should have waited for the nations to have made their respective points against Donald Trump? Because from the outside in, with due respect to the fact that this is, of course, an extremely important process that's taking place right now, it does seem like a major waste of time in some regards.
Well, with all due respect, I've got to push back against some of what I've been hearing. But to answer your question, the Constitution does not say a president could be impeached except in an election year. This has nothing to do with timing. It has everything to do with whether or not certain boundaries were crossed, boundaries of norms, boundaries of sometimes law, although it's very obvious if you read the Constitution, you look at the history, that breaking a specific law is not necessarily what merits impeachment, because at the time the Constitution was written, there was no federal code where we had specific federal laws that could or could not be violated. They hadn't been written yet. So that doesn't make any sense. It also, while I agree with the idea that executive privilege is something in terms of secrecy and energy, to quote the Federalist Papers, that those elements are very necessary in negotiations with foreign powers. Again, we have no record of any modern president actually offering something involving U.S. policy or the backing of the U.S. government in exchange for a personal favor for the president that is purely political in nature and purely designed to help the person damage his political opponent and win re-election. Again, horse trading, making the sausage, that is how politics works. I'm not arguing for some purist situation where, yes, as was earlier pointed out, the American people might not like what they see. Sometimes they should not know what is going on. In this case, the president made it obvious, as have a number of people on his own staff, that he was exchanging U.S. government favors for personal favors. And the idea that the American people don't support this, well, in terms of asking if Pelosi made a mistake and the House made a mistake, support for impeachment and support for removal has grown steadily. People are very interested in this. We're only in day 2 of the Senate trial. This is not some long thing that everyone's exhausted about, like the Clinton situation, which went on far, far longer in 1998 and 1999. And what people need to realize is that the Constitution makes it clear that this is for leaders to be able to decide if the people might not be paying attention, if the people have been whipped up into a frenzy, because the founders were very careful to not allow the passions of the people to run without some check on them as well. If some demagogue or tyrant, just like Trump, came to power, impeachment is the removal, because in this case, the president committed a crime that only the president could commit. And the idea that the aid wasn't held up, it was held up in the middle of a war. And with the aid being eventually released later, the whole idea, if there was nothing wrong and nothing corrupt in the intent, what they were asking for was perfectly fine, right? A perfect phone call. Then since they didn't get that investigation, why did they release the aid? They released the aid because they got caught by a whistleblower from within their own administration, within the intelligence community, that was later corroborated.
Brian, I'm going to cut you off just because we are quickly. Mark, I wanted to give you the final word. We just have about a minute left. Mark, I wanted you to respond there to Brian, A, and B. I want you to just tell us about the divisions within the country, because I know we've spoken about this in a previous conversation, I believe, as well. This is only going to divide the country further going to these elections and after these 2020 elections, won't it?
Well, the country is tremendously divided and polarized, but I wanted to pick up on an important point that my colleague made about the passions of the people. George Washington called the Senate comparable to a teacup or a teapot because it cools down. When you pour the hot water, it cools down the passions of the people. This is why the House vote on the impeachment is a majority, and the conviction is by 2/3 of the Senate. So we see that the House in its passion and the Democratic Party passionately impeached the president, but now it's in the Senate, where perhaps cooler heads will prevail. And the senators, I assure you, are very astute and attuned to this polarization in the country. They don't want to polarize the country any further. And you polarize the country by bringing up impeachments that are not valid and supportive. The Federalist Papers makes clear that you want to you expunge a person who needs to be removed from the public sphere. The question is, what Trump did, is that so markedly different from what other presidents do? And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm saying that real world, they picked something. The Mueller report, as my colleague said, didn't pan out. They picked something, and they're going for it. And I see it as a road to nowhere. So at the end of the day, we learn a lot about American government. We learn about the Constitution, but the people will not tolerate it. I don't think they will tolerate it. And the senators know it, and they know it, and the patience of the people will not allow it.
All right, let me say thank you to Ron, Mark, and Brian for their time today and for putting that all into context for us. The presidential trial, the impeachment trial, I should say, that's taking place in the U.S. Senate is an important one. As I put in my introduction as well, there are 2 points of view. The one point of view is that what's occurred vis-a-vis that call to Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine was a crime in the sense that he was withholding aid so that a personal favor could be carried out. But that, as Mark said within our discussion, other presidents have probably done this sort of thing behind the scenes. So is this really a crime? And then what of obstructing Congress? Is that really on the table here? Has he really obstructed Congress? Is that, again, a crime? Or is this just all partisan politics, especially in the year when an election is to take place just towards the end of this year? Also, are Democrats just playing partisan politics with this entire issue, which is significantly a serious issue at this point in time? Now, just before I sign off, I'd like to thank our viewers and, of course, my team for this now 200th episode of Scope. It's been a pleasure, of course, speaking to all of you on air and giving political analysis and having all of our guests join us as well to provide you balanced views on every issue. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.